For more than 100 years, steam engines drove Britain. But in the 1950s, the government planned to modernise the railways, scrap steam and close thousands of miles of track. Most people embraced it as progress, but a few resisted the changes. They made plans to open branch lines and bring back steam. Some even filmed their efforts. Their home movies tell the story of how they set about recreating this lost world, and how their commitment helped millions of people to reconnect to a past that most thought had gone forever.
The hair stands up on the back of your neck. It is absolutely wonderful.
It is a living being. The whole thing bursts into life with tremendous power.
Every schoolboy's wish, I've got to get onto an engine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Severn Valley Railway. Welcome to our Santa Special weekend.
It's the week before Christmas on a small railway that runs through Worcestershire and Shropshire, the Severn Valley Railway. There are hundreds of volunteers on duty.
Our next departure this afternoon will be the 12:40, the 1:15 service to Santa's Grotto. Are you hungry?
Paul Fathers is one of those volunteers. During the week, he works in the security industry.
So how do you like your bacon done? My wife likes it really burnt, but she's not here. Probably still in bed if she's got any sense.
Thousands of enthusiasts like Paul built the station and the platform he's walking along. They restored the coaches he's passing. They even rescued and restored 2857, the steam locomotive he's about to drive.
I started back in 1967 as a very young schoolboy. The railway was in its infancy. We had no locomotives, no coaches, and so I started helping out and then just stayed with it, really.
When Paul first got involved, there were just a handful of volunteers, but over the decades, railway preservation has blossomed. Today, there are more than 250 steam engines running on preserved lines right across the country. What captured the imagination of the handful of people like Paul was a love of the way railways in Britain used to be. But from the early 1950s, things changed. A newly nationalised British Railways Board planned to modernise the railways, uprooting thousands of miles of branch lines and ending the days of steam.
Well, in the 1950s, BR moves from a profit situation to a loss situation, and to a thumping loss situation. And this is something rather new for the politicians, because up until that stage, it's basically, well, you know, the railways run themselves and we don't really need to worry that much about them apart from times of national crisis like wars. Now they've got to do something about it because it's costing the Exchequer money at a time when we haven't got much money. The railways go from profit to loss in the 50s really because you start the great car economy. People start buying their first Austin 7 or whatever, or their first motorbike. The trunk roads, which were built in the 1930s, start to fill up and they start being developed more, and at the end of the 1950s you start the motorway building programme. And the whole thing rolls on from then.
British Railways responded to this financial crisis by weeding out unprofitable branch lines. In the 1950s, 3,000 miles out of a 20,000-mile network were lost. A few people resisted these closures, and two places, the Worth Valley in West Yorkshire and the Severn Valley in Shropshire and Worcestershire, were the vanguard of a movement that was to spread across the whole country.
They say, well, actually, we think people still want this service, and actually it's a public good. We ought to have this service. So if you're not going to run it, we will.
And that's just what happened in 1963 in Bridgnorth in Shropshire on the Severn Valley Railway.
What you see with the station name board is a group of us putting it back in its rightful place, where it should stand on the platform. That was, if you like, reclaiming the railway for us. When you think just a few humble rail enthusiasts could stop something like that, BR, from cutting the track up, that was marvellous. You know, it's fantastic, wasn't it?
That's Keith in the brown coat, in a home movie shot by one of the enthusiasts. He was 26 at the time.
Like lots of people, you just don't take a great deal of notice of things or do anything. But I felt at this stage, you know, with railways, it was my hobby, my love, that something had to be done.
What he did was write to his local paper. A meeting followed that came up with the astonishing idea of buying and running the railway themselves. They formed a committee, and another 20-something from Bewdley became treasurer.
We were called bunches of nutters. We were stupid. They didn't have anoraks in those days, by the way. That was before the days of anoraks. But the big key was to save the railway, to save our local branch lines. And they were being cut at such a rate, and they are the veins of the country, and were.
Keith and Colin weren't quite alone in their resistance to British Rail's closure programme. Further north in West Yorkshire, a few of the locals were campaigning to keep open a branch line in the Worth Valley.
I do remember one of the local mill owners saying, I don't care what you're going to run on the line. I don't care about the locomotives or the rolling stock. I want to know, will there still be a 7:15 train for my workers to get to mill?
Graham Mitchell was a teenager in Oakworth, a village in the Worth Valley, when in 1961 British Rail said it would close the line.
I remember on this platform, you know, boxes of day-old chicks being loaded. You remember that sort of importance to the locality. And the fact that it was the local people who first banded together to save it, because the locals wanted the transport link. You know, the railway had been here since the 1860s, doing the job it was built to do, moving people and goods up and down the valley. And people wanted it still to do that.
Graham, along with other locals, began a campaign to keep the branch line open. It was led by a college lecturer, Bob Cryer.
This is a photograph taken in the spring of '63 when I was engaged to Bob, and he was the parliamentary candidate for Darwin and I was a town councillor. It's quite a nice photograph of him making a speech and myself looking admiringly on.
They met in 1961 at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool.
For 2 nights during the week they would have a dance, and at this dance this young man came and asked me to dance with him, tall, quite good looking young man, and told me all about his ambition to preserve a railway, which I thought was slightly bonkers, but I thought, well, other than that he seemed to be all right. Bob was a very much larger than life character. I was, at that time, I know I'm not now, but at that time, I was a fairly sort of subdued person. I was very impressed by him, but possibly more impressed by his car, two-tone green, colour of your jumper, two-tone green Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire. And whatever he did it to the nth degree. People either thought he was absolutely wonderful, or he got right up their nose.
The noses he really got up belonged to the British Rail executives who refused to keep the branch line open. So the campaign he led switched tack to raise money, buy the line and run it themselves. While negotiations with British Rail dragged on, volunteers worked at weekends to save what was left of the track. David Kay was one of the founding members.
When negotiations got a bit further on, they said, we can maintain the track and run work strands. Well, the track was in disgusting condition. It had been run down for years. Its main crop was pussy willows. At Damhams, you couldn't see the track, and they have hellish roots, these pussy willows.
To help tackle the pussy willow problem, volunteers came from across the north of England. As well as his scythe, Brian Baker brought his film camera.
What you're seeing there is our desire to see the track back to what it should be, nice and neat, weed-free, the cesses, the sides of the track, all neat and tidy.
Like many of the volunteers, Brian had a history of involvement with steam railways.
My father was a station master in Ireland and on the West Cork railways, and I've always been a railway nut. I think it runs in my blood. It's just one of those things. I was never afraid of manual labour. I thoroughly enjoyed what we did at the railway. I mean, you did it at home, digging gardens and things, doing fences, laying footpaths and so on. But there was a totally different feel about working on a railway. And when you did it, you felt you'd achieved something.
Volunteers in the Worth Valley weren't the only ones weeding out unwanted growth. In the aftermath of the 1963 Beeching Report, British Rail was pruning ever more branches. Groups up and down the country responded with plans to save their local line. For the volunteers in Bridgnorth on the Severn Valley line, rescuing the track was arduous and heavy work. But in 1966, they got a tremendous boost. They found an old works trolley.
You'd go along, we'd use our feet like this on the sleepers, highly dangerous. We recovered bits and pieces, brought them up from further down the railway, back up to Bridgnorth. And, you know, we thought that was a big thing. We'd actually got something to go up and down with.
We even rescued some little ground signals. We pushed this trolley 5 miles, a couple of 3 times on a Sunday. And so it was a respite to jump on the thing and come whizzing down the bank into the station.
The volunteers worked every weekend for 2 years. They ran open days to raise the deposit they would need to buy just 5 miles of track from British Rail.
We got a lot of sleepers that were lying about in the station yard and put these on bricks. And this little steam engine went up and down, you know, along the platform, charging five pence a ride or something like that. All to raise the £2,500 deposit to give to BR, so we could be sure that we'd got the railway line.
And then a lot of publicity was produced to show what our idea was. And in due course, we started getting 1 or 2 railwaymen interested. And they, of course, with their knowledge, was exactly what we wanted.
A steam engine driver, John Hill, joined in 1966. But there was no engine for him to drive.
All the time we were putting in, it could have gone to waste. We certainly didn't know whether we were going to get any steam engines or not. We got to find a tremendous sum of money to buy the 5 miles of line from Bridgnorth to Hampton Load, and we didn't even know whether we'd be able to succeed in doing that. So it was just an act of faith on everybody's part.
Help would come from a most unexpected quarter. British Railways were in the middle of a modernisation programme, replacing all their steam engines with diesel and electric trains.
You end up with lines and lines of locomotives parked up in scrapyards being cut right through the 1960s. Locomotives that used to be the king of the road, used to be the thing that really pulled the Premier Expresses. Looking rather shabby, taken to a scrapyard and sliced into bits to feed the motor industry.
British Rail's decision to scrap so many steam engines was ironically just the boost the Severn Valley volunteers needed. They sold some of their redundant locomotives to steam enthusiasts. A Great Western engine, 3205, was bought by a group who then offered it to the Severn Valley, providing the society could raise the £2,500 deposit and buy the 5 miles of line. It took them 3 years to raise what seems today such a trifling amount. But on Easter Saturday, March 1967, 3205 arrived at Bridgnorth. After 4 years' absence, steam had returned to the Severn Valley.
We just didn't believe it. It was there. It's a real life steam engine.
A whole station jammed with people of all ages had come to see this engine arrive. The enthusiasm was just absolutely tremendous.
It was absolutely incredible. It was a marvellous day.
The driver on that day was John Hill.
I was quite a dashing young blade in those days. I didn't ever get round to going to a cinema and slashing the seats, but it was that sort of era. I had a huge brill cream quiff, which I look back on now as I looked like some kind of idiot. But that was all the rage at the time. Nobody was absolutely certain that this day was ever going to come, and here it was. Not only an engine, but we brought 4 coaches with it as well. We did all kinds of weird and wonderful things which we weren't supposed to do, giving people rides in and out of the station. It was euphoria gone mad, I suppose.
For Colm Howell, the arrival of that first engine was a boyhood dream come true. He could finally learn how to drive a steam engine.
I loved it. A steam engine is a very live thing. You've got the heart of the engine, which of course is the fire. You've got the blood, which is the steam. And that steam is transferred by the reciprocation of the valves to the pistons, and the pistons then push the rods and onto the rail. And there is this terrific exhilaration when you're driving a steam engine of the thing, working up its speed and all that sort of thing, the fire going absolutely white hot, and watching the gauges to make sure that you've got the correct steam pressure, the water pressure. And it isn't just shoveling coal into a hole. You've got to put it where the coal's wanted. And this is where the skill comes in.
When you feel the engine move for the first time as a result of your effort, it is absolutely wonderful.
John Hill was very sympathetic to us amateurs, and I would never, ever claim to be a professional driver. When you see the professional do it, you think, God, I wish I could do it like that.
Any hope that was flagging, any enthusiasm that started to flag was immediately boosted. And so Severn Valley Railway was underway. We were going places.
Colm Howell and John Hill weren't the only ones enjoying the experience of steam. British Rail's policy of moving to diesel and electric power was giving people up and down the country the chance to buy their very own steam locomotive.
Where I lived as a youngster, when you went to bed at night, you were never without the sound of a train going by.
Richard Greenwood lived close to the Worth Valley Railway in West Yorkshire. He and some friends were keen to buy a small engine.
One of our favourite engines was the pug engines. They were so typical of where we lived. It was part of our heritage, really, even though at that stage we were only in our 20s. Any small engine, it's called a pug engine. Most railways that served industrial areas had a fleet of these because they used them in docks where they could go around right-angle bends between one dock and the other. And I remember them very well from seeing them shunting a low-level shunting yard in Salford. And to get from one yard to the other yard, they had to cross the street. And every time they had to do this, a man came out with a red flag, stood in the middle of the road like that, and held the traffic up while the engine went across. Well, there's a band of us around that time, probably about 12 or 18, who were dead keen. So we decided we'd do what we could to buy a pug engine. Started printing photographs and selling them to people, having stalls at exhibitions and selling this, that and the other. And bit by bit, we raised a bit of money. And bit by bit, we had enough to buy this engine and to transport it.
By 1964, they'd raised the money, £450. To move it, Pickford's charged £80.
It came on a low loader all the way from Neath in South Wales. And when, on the morning, they started to unload it, unfortunately, the wheels missed the rails, and the crew, obviously used to this sort of thing, they used jacks to jack it up and throw it over onto the tracks. Then they went away with the Pickford Scammell tractor. Job done.
The problem for Richard and his friends was that they'd nowhere to put the engine.
So you go out and you buy a steam locomotive relatively cheaply by present day standards, and then you find the wife saying, well, you're not going to keep that in the back garden. So what do you do with it?
Initially, they have permission to run them on the state network, and they can run rail tours with them, and they may get a place in a shed to park them and so on. However, BR decides they don't want any locomotives they don't own running on the network. In 1968, when they run their last steam locomotive, they also ban all other steam engines from running on the network. And this is great for the start of the preserve lines, because they basically suddenly have the monopoly to be able to run steam engines. If you own a big steam engine, or even a small one, you've got no choice. You've got to go to one of those nascent schemes that are just starting out and say, do you mind if I bring my loco to your railway? And of course the railways themselves are short of power. They're run by enthusiasts, and the first thing they're going to say is yes.
In Rochdale, Richard Greenwood needed a home for the pug, and the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway was the obvious, indeed the only realistic home for it.
We approached the officers of the railway here. If we buy one of these engines, can we bring it? And they said yes. As simple as that, on the basis really of a telephone call. No agreements, nothing written, nothing like that at all.
There were people here working to reopen the railway. There were people coming in from left field with rolling stock. Each group needed the other, and so it was a happy marriage.
The locals realised that the railway meant something. And the appearance of a steam engine in the yard, of course, began to convince the locals that something was going to happen here. British Railway gave permission to run a weekly works train to go out with wagons and tools and start clearing the drains, putting the fences in order, relaying bits of bad track and things like that. And this engine was ideal for that because it was quite small and it didn't burn much coal and it didn't cost very much to run.
And it made money too. £50 for this advert featuring Ronnie Corbett.
The railway was very important to commercial organisations, such as the advertising company, because they had the railway to themselves for the day, if that's how they wanted it. And money changed hands, but what we were after, of course, was maximum publicity. Ronnie Corbett, I've got my own little bits of film of him on the day. There he is. The bit of film I've got of him is doing his wardrobe on the Ingrove platform, doing up his fly. He really was a character. The effect they wanted was for the viewer to think that poor Ronnie Corbett, had been plastered on the front of this locomotive coming towards you, the viewer, when of course he hadn't. He'd been filmed going backwards. The poor cameraman had to trust the driver that he would go backwards and not come forward. Ronnie Corbett has got the secret of the simple biscuits, and there he is, in a tunnel trying to tell everybody about it.
I know how Symbol baked those delicious chocolate chips into Maryland cookies. The secret is...
I know the Symbol secret! I know the Symbol secret! I know the Symbol...
All the effort made by the Little Pug and the West Yorkshire volunteers paid dividends when the Worth Valley Railway reopened in 1968, 6 years after British Rail had first closed the line. Two years later, it was the turn of the Severn Valley Railway, and by 1970 there were 18 steam railway preservation groups across the country. Just as hundreds of branch lines were closing and steam had gone forever from the main line, the preservation movement was gaining momentum. Then, in the summer of 1970, there was a film set in the Worth Valley that would take railway preservation to new and undreamed-of heights. Graham Mitchell landed a part.
This is actually the spot where I stood to flag off the train in several sequences in the 1970 film.
Can you remember what you said?
Yes, Bernard Cribbin said to me,
On the way, Mr. Mitchell! And give it a butt!
I was slightly over-enthusiastic with the flag, only slightly.
The film was Lionel Jeffrey's box office sensation, The Railway Children.
The railway was being used for 6 weeks. It had to provide a lot of volunteers over that period, and the appeal went out to the qualified volunteers to say we actually need guards and firemen and drivers. I was teaching in Dudley. It was a week's half term, and I came up here for a week's holiday, and I said I'll work every day as a guard.
As well as needing the Society's volunteers, the film needed its locomotives. This one, 957, featured heavily.
This, it doesn't look like it today, but this was the Green Dragon in the Railway Children film. For the Railway Children, it was required to be green to fulfil the name of the Green Dragon. I think it looks wonderful, but sometimes people are disappointed that it doesn't look like the Green Dragon.
All the volunteers, rolling stock and engines were organised by the railway's chairman, Bob Cryer. And he even found time to shoot this behind-the-scenes home movie.
He got a credit for it, which he thought was just absolutely bliss to have a credit for a feature film.
After my week of filming, I went back to Dudley on the Sunday night, and I was back in the classroom on Monday morning. And on Monday evening, I got a phone call from the assistant director saying, "Oh, we want you on set again tomorrow, Tuesday morning." I said, "Well, no, I'm back. I'm back in the classroom. I'm sorry."
And it happened to be the day when they were filming Daddy Coming Back.
Anne's husband, Bob, stepped in.
There is a vague figure, which is Bob, in Graham's outfit. And at that point, Bernard Cribbin says, "Right away, Mr. Cryer." It was great with that, because otherwise he would have had his credit at the beginning, but he wouldn't have had a part in it.
Bob Cryer died in a car accident in 1994.
What he wanted more than anything was that those people who did the work made the decisions. In essence, it was a sort of socialist, democratic experiment, and it works to this day.
Don't you think it's extraordinary, David, that here we are as two elderly gentlemen now, and it's 42 years since this film was made, and we're still here, part of it.
Yeah.
But an old chap in the village, said to me, "Do you know what's really is important about that film? There's no drugs in it, no sex, no folk running around with no clothes on. It's just a nice morality story for the family, And it all works out."
And it's amazing when you consider how much the producer swore.
No, we're going to cut that bit, David. It is said that Lionel Jeffrey's daughter read the book and said, "Daddy, you really must make a film of this." Lionel came up here and saw the railway and was convinced that this was the place. And the wonderful thing, of course, from the point of view of promotion of the railway, is that he kept Oakworth as the name of the station.
Whereas in the book it's called Meadow Vale. He retained it for the film, and it did us wonders.
After the film was released, there was a flock of new visitors to the railway. because the film has been shown so often on television, and because Barry Norman says it's the finest British film ever made for children in this country, it's got an enduring attraction which continues to bring people here time after time and year after year.
The impact on the Worth Valley was phenomenal.
That causes a great problem, the railway children. All of a sudden, we were carrying about 60,000 passengers. And then we didn't know whether, shall we lock it up and run away? We carried 4,000 odd passengers in a day on one train. So it was decided then to put the loop in.
This model demonstrates the principle. The loop on the right is the short section of line on a single track that allows trains to pass each other.
Once we had the Railway Children film, there was such an increase in traffic that we realised straight away we needed to run more trains. So the way to do that was to split the line in two and have a place for the trains to pass, which is why we built this loop line at the side of the main line here, so that we could have a train in each section and they can cross each other. That gives you twice as many trains. My grandfather worked on the railways. I'd always been fascinated by the idea of how you control traffic and control trains.
Bruce became a volunteer on the railway in his teens. He and his mates installed the loop in time for the influx of visitors in 1971.
The loop had to be controlled somehow. Originally we just had some levers at each end and a person on the ground signalled the trains basically by hand. But of course that wasn't suitable for a permanent arrangement, so we had to find a signal box and put some proper signalling in, and that's where the signal box behind came in.
How they got the box was typical of the determination of the volunteers. Bruce found it near Bradford and he contacted British Rail.
And they were willing to sell it. And so I bought the actual building I bought, because by then I was an employee, on what was known as a firewood order, which was a note originally intended purely for buying firewood. So that's a piece of firewood, officially.
Once it was paid for, all they had to do was bring it to the railway and make it work.
We set about thinking about how to move it, and rather than try and take it apart and risk damaging it, we thought it would be practical to move it in one piece. So I contacted a crane hire firm and they agreed that they could do the lift. And that's how it came along the road all the way from Bradford to Oakworth, further up the line, and then we brought it down on a train to its present position on this loop line, and it was then taken off on rollers onto a pile of sleepers above the foundations, which were then jacked down and the box was put down on its base. It's an interesting way of doing it. Others have done it since, but I think we can probably claim a first for moving a signal box in one piece.
While the loop was a great success, the Railway Children was to have an effect on preservation well beyond the Worth Valley. The film captured a seemingly lost world of steam, a world for which the British public held a particular affection. It was a nostalgia that the preservation societies were quick to exploit.
Some of these preserved railways, which have got really quite clever marketing teams, start to think about this and think, well, actually, what are we selling here? We're selling a kind of symbol of the past. The best of the preserved railways recreate this past on their own stations. You'll be surrounded by enamel signs and often staff in wool sort of jacket uniform, sometimes with a a flower in the buttonhole, looking exactly like you might have looked were the Royal train passing through your station in about 1950.
You'll see the original tap and the stop tap cover still originally there. That was not new put in, that was still there when we built it, saying GWR W for water.
Volunteers began to fashion this world of the railway from a bygone era in minute detail. This is Malcolm Broadhurst at Bewdley Station on the Severn Valley Railway.
It's only a gents urinal, but it is superb and it is recreating what was here. If we're going to try and bring the railway back to as it was, you want to try and get it looking as it was.
The restoration of the loo was just a part of the big jigsaw of the railway, really. When you look at the effort that was required to restore the line and the station and the rolling stock.
It might have been just a loo, but volunteer Phil Cheesewright thought it was worth filming.
At that time I was filming trains along the line and other things. It just happened that this was a project that happened to be going on at the time, purely accidentally.
They discovered the loo more than 250 miles away on a platform at Melrose Station in Scotland.
When we got there, we took the gutter off. That was easy peasy, just came off, cut it down. And then I think we tried sliding these up and a bit of hammering, not too much heavy. And of course it wouldn't dismantle, and we thought, oh my God, what are we going to do?
A blowtorch came in handy. Then came the logistical nightmare of getting it home.
Luckily as would have it, where it was situated, there was a platform edge next door. And we were able to just back the truck up to the platform edge, and all we did then was lower the sections down onto the platform and just slid them in.
I think we regarded ourselves as adventurers, pioneers. We didn't fund it from ticket sales, we funded it ourselves. We put our hands in our pockets and raised the cash we needed to take the project on.
One of the volunteers who helped rebuild it is the driver of the Santa Special, Paul Fathers.
The reason I became involved is there wasn't a lot going on. There's nothing on a Sunday apart from church, and of course I was in the choir and did my bit, but there was nothing much going on, so being able to come here and help to restore the railway seemed a very sensible thing to do.
Did I see you in red flares then, Paul?
Quite possibly, yes. Yes. It was fashionable at the time.
Yes.
As was the haircut.
Yeah.
Paul was young and a heartthrob in those days. You can see me in his John Travolta phase later on in the film.
We invited the Mayor of Bewdley to open it, who congratulated us on providing Bewdley with the first urinal on this side of the river.
I like the mat idea, to wipe your feet before you went into the toilet. We wanted to recreate the railway as it would have been probably in the 1930s, 1940s, probably up to the 1950s. So when people take the ride on the steam train, they get to look at railway stations as they were probably in their heyday.
By the time the urinal opened in 1975, preservation societies were growing very quickly. They were all recreating a sense of the past with steam at its heart. But they faced a big problem. Now that British Rail had scrapped all its engines, where would they find the locomotives they needed to cope with the huge public appetite for steam? They would find engines in the most unlikely of places, in a scrapyard in South Wales. It's where, in 1971, a group of volunteers from the Severn Valley found this Great Western locomotive, number 2857. They raised the money, bought the engine, towed it back to the Severn Valley, and have been working on it off and on ever since.
I'm just having a struggle with this one screw here, which I think has got to be a longer one. I've got it the wrong way around. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that, H.
I'm going to talk to you.
Yeah, well, I'm trying not to breathe in.
Oh, right, okay, no, fair enough.
For my health, it's very, very fine dust. It's the same as loft insulation, and it can damage your lungs if you're not careful. One of the reasons why I got involved, I could see all the other engines that were being preserved were express engines with names, and I can remember these because I lived in Wolverhampton, right next to the main line, and I can remember these trundling up and down day in, day out, and I didn't think that anybody was going to bother rescuing one of these, so that's why I got involved.
You've not got a tape measure on you, have you?
No, it's
Mine's
about
in the
like
car. Is it?
Yeah.
Right, I'll... That's it.
The man looking for the tape measure is Steve Whittaker. Steve took over the role of engineering team leader in 1980. But his interest in steam engines goes back much further.
When I was 3, my dad drew a train after tea one day, and it was really good and lifelike. And the next time the pencil and drawing paper came out, before he even picked the pencil up, it was, "Dad, will you draw me a train?" And it just somehow gets in your blood. It's an infectious hobby.
He would need all his enthusiasm and lots of know-how to restore 2857. The job would be massive.
Organising all the missing parts that had been taken off the engine, which is very, very difficult and complex. Drawings required, patterns to make castings, machining, and all stuff that the average, even railway enthusiast, is not familiar with these parts. So a great deal to learn.
2857 was just one of more than 200 steam engines rusting away in the Barry scrapyard.
I can remember going down to Barry scrapyard and looking at it, and I thought, you're wasting your time here. It's an absolute load of scrap and nothing else.
It was in poor condition, having been left out in the open for many years, but compared with many of the engines in the scrapyard, this one was actually fairly complete.
The scrapyard in Barry has a special place in the history of steam preservation in Britain. It was one of many hired by British Rail to cut up thousands of redundant steam locomotives. All the other scrapyards got on with the job, but in Barry, the owner, Di Woodham, hadn't got round to doing it. Preservation societies like the Severn Valley headed for South Wales. Colm Howell joined the party.
I used to do it in 2 hours from here. We used to go down, a little group of us, which was great fun because you'd go to Wales and it was always lovely weather down there at Barry. Lovely. In the summer we used to go to Barry Island and have our chips, and go around on the Big Dipper and everything. Just good fun. And of course you used to fool about, getting your overalls on and pushing people over and all that sort of thing. Oh, it was great fun. The atmosphere at Barry was very special because there were other railways, Keighley and Worth Valley, Dart Valley, Bluebell, and other railways coming up, all wanting to preserve another engine for another. And you all sort of looked at each other and saying, I hope you're not going to touch my engine, and so you'd mark it up for preservation. But we often pulled our work so that we could help each other to get our engines ready. So we all set to on the 28's bearings. There's three of us sitting down there, rather like milking a cow, basically. We're working away with this emery cloth. You had to do it like this. One started, then the next one, and then the next one. And it was all part of it. It was just such fun.
It was a long uphill struggle, rescuing the parts that all the other scrap men and other enthusiasts and collectors were ravaging, trying to get everything that was valuable off the engine before it went missing.
And what about the chap who sold it to you?
Di Woodham, well, very interesting character. We're all very thankful to him because having bought 236 locos, he then continued cutting up steel coal wagons for several years, and all the engines were just left languishing in the yard, which was great for preservationists.
He doesn't cut them up because he doesn't need to. He's at the bottom end of the Welsh valleys, and they're getting rid of the little coal wagons, and they're much easier to cut up than a steam locomotive, which is quite complicated, so he doesn't bother to cut them up. He leaves them to one side. It's kind of like his nest egg for when he retires.
Di Woodham died in 1994. His sons, Paul and John, grew up around the scrapyard.
All this would be big piles of scrap, and this was where everything took place, the main part. All the cranes would be working, all the burners would be working. These are photos of the wagon wheels. The piles of them just shows you how many wagons that come through. And I can remember the axles stacked on either side of the lines where all the wagons were cut up. We just kept cutting and cutting, and we didn't have time to cut up the steam engines. It was a playground for all the kids. My favourite game was to start at one end and see if I get from one end to the other without getting off them. And I go up through the chimneys, across the top, down, and from one engine to the other. As people realised they were here and more people came to visit, then they suddenly realised these were the last. And then somebody had obviously said to him, "Can we buy one off you?" Yes. And it just snowballed and snowballed. In hindsight, they were lucky. You go away to these preservation societies and you see something that would never have been if it wasn't for him.
But nothing happened overnight. It took 4 years of hard fundraising before the group had raised the £5,700, 80,000 in today's prices, they needed to buy the engine. Bob Kite filmed the journey as it was towed to Bewdley.
It arrived here August the 13th in 75. We started replacing the copper pipes and making the gunmetal fittings that were missing. And in 1979 we steamed it just to see what it was like. And then we found out why British Rail had withdrawn it. It was an absolute bag of nails. And
they discovered a crack in the cylinder block. It was a disaster that could have ruined 8 years' work on their dream project. But Steve scoured the country and a year later found a replacement cylinder in a South Wales steelworks. Then 4 more years of hard graft started.
The whole locomotive was stripped and rebuilt to mainline condition in the elements, out in the open. It was even painted to completion out in the open at Bewdley. Incredible. And here's the living proof. Anyone feeling strong?
That's at your end.
The thing that's made 2857, an unpopular old goods engine as it is, a success, is the tremendous guys that we've got. A ramshackle team from all walks of life who work like Trojans.
Okay, get that much a bit nearer this end. Right, just a bit in the middle. Whoa.
If something wanted doing, you know, Steve would do it or get somebody else to do it, which is the sort of chap that you want. I mean, I've done my fair share, but I think I've taken him as a lead, really. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have got anywhere, I don't think.
I wouldn't swap it for anything. You never get me to a football match. Too much railway engineering to be done.
Mission accomplished.
Harry?
Yeah.
Steve and Bob's story on the Severn Valley could be replicated right across the country. These days, all over Britain, more than 200 restored steam locomotives are running on more than 100 preserved railway lines, and they cover 500 miles of track.
The achievement of the preserved railway movement is to go in a little over 60 years from nothing at all to having hundreds of railways, thousands of volunteers, hundreds of steam locomotives working, and millions of visitors, which means that, you know, they've become part of our day-to-day lives, and that's a major achievement.
Steam preservation touched a nerve with the nation. It helped us rediscover a history we thought we'd lost. And as well as being part of our heritage, steam has become part of today's economy. Some societies have their own railway and carriage workshops. They're even building steam engines from new. But the backbone of the movement remains the thousands of volunteers who continue to turn out day after day, week after week, to ensure that the trains run on time.
They're even doing things like running Santa specials, so that, you know, if you're a child of 4 these days, you probably go to at least 3 preserved railways in the course of your childhood, because they'll take you on a Santa special. And that's something the railways invented and run, and it's a big part of their income. And it is probably one of the reasons why you no longer go to a department store to see Santa, because he's on a steam train at a railway near you.